All right, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're watching this. This is Puritan. It's 9:56 here in Southern Oregon, where I call home, but I still got my reading done today. Got my book, got some notes. If you can just about see that, there we go. Let's jump in. A massive welcome to you if you're joining us for the first time. Like I said, Puritan, and this is part of a 30-day reading challenge, working our way through the excellent Puritan work, Precious Remedies Against Satan's Devices by Thomas Brooks. If you're watching this and you just came across this or heard about this, you're in a good place. It's only day one. You still got time to catch up. Down in the description below, there will be a link to my webpage that has the reading plan for this, as well as some additional material that we'll throw up there as we go. Well, today was day one, and that had us looking at the introduction, what Watson called the proof of the point, and then the first of the devices that he wants to look at. And if you have no idea what he means by devices, well, we'll get to that actually in our introduction. So, like I said, I've got some notes in front of me here, and so I'm just going to work my way through just some things to help you kind of orient today's reading, as well as a couple of personal thoughts that I had based on it. So let's jump in. Now, the reading plan didn't have you reading what's called the Epistle Dedicatory, but I did read it just out of, curiosity mostly, but also a desire to kind of orient myself to the world of this book, and I'm actually glad I did. So if you didn't get a chance to read that, I'd encourage you to go ahead and read that as you're able. But in his sort of dedicatory letter, which is what that is, Brooks says that there are 4 things that it's important for every Christian to know. He says every Christian needs to know Christ, the scriptures, their own heart, and Satan's devices. In fact, Brooks puts it like this. He says, if any cast off the study of these, they cannot be saved here, as in here in this life, nor happy hereafter. Well, that's a way to sell that if ever there was one. That if you don't understand Christ, the scriptures, the nature of your own heart, and the nature of Satan's devices against the Christian, you can't be happy in this life you can't be safe in this life, or happy in the one to come. Another thing that Brooks does in his opening letter is that he gives us several reasons for exploring this issue. It's often good to know why an author is writing, whether you're reading your Bible or reading anything else. And so he does actually tell us why he is writing. He gives us a few reasons. He says, first of all, Satan has a greater influence on men, and as he puts it, and higher advantages over them than they think he has. Here he's simply noting the fact that the reality is the devil has more of an advantage over us at times than we're prone to think he does. And if you forget that he has an advantage over you, or you don't know that he has an advantage over you, he's got even a greater one. So Brooks is really writing to ensure that, well, we aren't disadvantaged in some way because we don't know how our adversary operates. Secondly, he says, actually, just lots of people pressed me to do this. He said lots of people just seem to ask me and press me and put pressure on me to do this, so I'm doing it, which I think is kind of reassuring, because he's writing this because people asked for the help, and so he offers the help, which I think shows the heart of a pastor, which is super encouraging. Another thing he says is that the satanic opposition that he encountered while studying this gave him, this is how he puts it in the book, an edge upon his spirit. Almost as though, like, as he was studying this, there was so much opposition, it only doubled his resolve that, I need to talk about this, which is a very interesting way to look at a subject like this. Many of us would say, oh, this is really hard, I probably shouldn't do this. But he says, no, this was really hard, and I knew the opposition of the evil one, and so I kept on pressing in, which I thought was fascinating. He goes on and notes that it felt as though the devil wanted to keep the spotlight off of his work, as it were, almost like he didn't want this to get out. And that's pretty fascinating, just the awareness of the evil one that not only Brooks but many other Puritans seemed to work with. They were never under the assumption that the evil one just did stuff. But no, they were very keenly aware of the fact that he was active in the world, and he was active with purpose. He was ensuring that the truth about him didn't get out. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Another reason that he gives is that he says this is valuable knowledge for all Christians, regardless of their status in life. Whether you are rich or poor, whether you're male or female, whether you're young or old, you need to know something of how the devil operates and how he works in the life of the believer. It's interesting, he also says that no one else in his time had really touched this subject, which I think is fascinating, because we would tend to think, well, the Puritans were, in my opinion anyway, one of the greatest generations of Christians. Surely they would have talked about this stuff. But apparently this was not all that high on their agenda. Well, maybe that's not a fair thing to say. It may have been that they just weren't treating it as much as he would have liked. It's hard to tell because he doesn't go into too much detail about that. But I thought that was interesting. He also notes that he has something of an international audience. He was already pretty well known in his day. And so people from all over the world were reaching out to him, wanting him to touch on this issue, which is interesting. And I think the final reason he gives, I think is one of the most fascinating, is that he says essentially life is short, and I want to spend my time doing that which is useful to God's people. Which again is a really interesting way to approach writing something like this. He's not just writing it for the fun of it, but he's writing it because he wants to see God's people helped. And so I thought that was pretty fascinating actually in reading that what's called the Epistle Dedicatory. Again, it wasn't part of our reading today, but I thought it was helpful nonetheless. Well, with all of that as an introduction, well, let's get into today's reading, and I'll make this super quick because you already read it, I hope. So in his introduction, he essentially gives us his foundation scripture, which is 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 11. Quoting from the Authorized Version, it says, "Lest Satan should take an advantage of us, for we are not ignorant of his devices." And that's where he gets his title for the book from, this language of Satan having devices and the believer not being ignorant of them. Now, in typical Puritan fashion, what Brooks does, and does very well, is that he gives us a explanation of the context of the verse that he is looking at and lifting his theme from. And so the context of 2 Corinthians chapter 2 is, if you know Paul's writings to the Corinthian churches, Paul wrote actually 4 letters technically. We have 2 of them that make up 1st and 2nd Corinthians in our Bibles. Well, in 1 Corinthians, if you know that book well, in chapter 5, there's this really weird story of this guy who was sleeping with his stepmother. And Paul says, you guys should be dealing with that, but you're not dealing with it, you're rejoicing in it. So here's what I'm going to tell you to do. That guy needs to be put out of the congregation, what we would today call church discipline. He needs to be put out and excommunicated from the body, so that while the body may be destroyed, his soul can be saved in the day of the Lord. And he's pretty forceful with them about the need to do this. Well, it would appear the Corinthians took him to heart, and they did the thing that he told them to do. Problem. By the time we get to 2 Corinthians, which is really the 4th letter that Paul writes to them, by the time we get to 2 Corinthians, they've left him kind of outside in the cold for way too long. He's been outside of the body, even though he's repentant, and they've just left him out there. And Paul has to now write and say, guys, you're doing too much. Let him back in, please. But the reason why, he gives actually several reasons why they should bring the man back in. So in chapter 2, verse 6, he says, the punishment was more than enough. Like, okay, guys, good job. You listened to me. Don't cross over into being too severe. Like, it's not good for him spiritually to not be part of the body. Bring him back in. Verses 7 through 10, Paul makes this point that you want to be careful also that he's not overrun by too much sorrow, that he's not left in a state of being ultimately like almost sorry for himself in a very spiritually unhealthy way. So actually, bring him back in for his own soul's sake. And then he mentions verse 11, and this language of not allowing Satan to have an advantage over them or over this person, because we are not ignorant of his devices. And so from that, Brooks lifts what he calls a main point. And he says the main point is that Satan has his several devices to deceive, entangle, and undo the souls of men. Let me read that again. It should be up on screen. Satan has his several devices to deceive, entangle, and undo the souls of men. That Satan has all of these devices, all of these schemes, all of these weapons that he uses to mess with the souls of people. And so if Satan has these devices, well, here's the plan of attack that Brooks gives us in this book. Really, he gives us a little statement laying out what he's going to do in this book. He says he's going to prove his point. He's going to show these devices. He's going to give some remedies. And then he's going to show us how our adversary does all of this, essentially. And then he's going to lay down some propositions demonstrating how to deal with these devices. And that's really what he does throughout this book. He kind of cycles through those multiple aims. Now, in his so-called proof of the point, what he does now, like any good preacher, is he's stated his point. He's gone to the text. He's stated his point. And now he's going to show you this point as it's made elsewhere in the Bible. And so he actually looks at a number of passages. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 11, where he talks about the wiles of the devil. And he says that this term for wiles signifies such snares as are laid behind one, such treacheries as come upon one's back at unawares. That there are certain methods that Satan uses that are sneaky, that aren't quite as obvious, that require a little bit of work to be able to follow along with what he's doing. He also quotes 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 26, where he talks about those who have been taken captive by the devil to do his will. And he says that language is the idea of being taken alive. When I was making my notes this afternoon, I used the language of prisoner of war, like a spiritual POW, like he's taken them alive and he's captured them. And Brooks makes the point that the devil does this to some people, and so we need to know how he does it. And finally, he goes to Revelation chapter 2 and verse 24. Revelation 2:24, and where Jesus is speaking to the church at Thyatira, and he says that there are some among you who teach what they call the so-called depths of Satan. And he says, I'm not going to put any such burden on you. And he makes the point that there are some who, through their teaching, who are actually claiming to speak for God, but were ultimately speaking for the evil one. And so that's another method the enemy uses. And so really, Brooks devotes his time in this proof of the point to lay out the doctrine, to lay out what he's going to talk about, and to show us how he got there. Now we get to the meat of the book and what we're going to read for the next 30 days. And what Brooks does is he divides the devices into a number of different categories. The first category that he deals with is what he calls Satan's devices to draw the soul to sin. Satan's devices to draw the soul to sin. And really today all we read was the first device. One thing I like about Brooks is that he uses these word pictures very well. And here's an example of this. He says the first device that Satan uses is to present the bait and hide the hook. In the Discord chat that we have for this reading discussion, and if you're reading this during the 30 days, you can join us in the Discord chat at any time. The link will be in the description. In the Discord chat today, one of the brothers noted kind of his own example. I've never been fishing. I'd really love to go, but I've never been. But he had been fishing, and he noted that when you go fishing and you don't want the fish to see this big shiny hook, you got to work really hard to hide that thing so that all they see is the bait. And he remembered that picture well, because he's like, yeah, that's exactly how fishing works. Well, the devil works in the same way. That for the people of God, what he does is he attempts to show us the sweetness of sin. Listen to how Brooks puts it. He says, that Satan's first device is to present the sweet, the pleasure, and the profit that may flow in upon the soul by yielding to sin, and to hide from the soul the wrath and misery that will certainly follow the committing of sin. So our adversary doesn't show us the bad that sin brings, the danger that sin brings. Brooks says that actually from the beginning, and he cites our first parents, that from Adam and Eve on, what he has done is he has shown us what on the surface looks like the benefit of giving into this, without showing us the danger that comes with it. And really that's all he addresses in this the end of the section that we read today. What this device is, the fact that he hides the hook, but he shows us the bait. He shows us the enticing thing, but not the danger behind that enticing thing. Listen to what he says here. Satan with ease pawns falsehoods upon us by his golden baits, and then he leads us and leaves us in a fool's paradise. He promises the soul honor, pleasure, profit, but pays the soul with the greatest contempt, shame, and loss that can be. Exactly what sin does. Sin, in a very real sense, over promises and under delivers. As we wrap up today, I thought I'd just share one personal thing, especially from this reading, that grabbed me. And it was just the awareness of the fact that this stuff is not just our flesh, which I think we're very easy to talk about, especially in at least the theological tradition that I come from. We're very good at talking about indwelling sin and the flesh, but we don't often talk about the devil and what he does in enticing those remnants of indwelling sin. And I think one thing you get from Brooks that I think is super encouraging is the fact that he is keenly aware of the work of the evil one, and the fact that the devil works in conjunction with our fallen nature and with the world around us to entice us. And I think that's important for us to bear in mind, that there is a very real personal devil out there who wants to stop at nothing to harm us. Well, I want to hear what you thought. Whether you're watching this on YouTube or in the Discord chat, leave a comment and tell me what stuck out to you from this day one reading. I'm Kofi Boy, and I'll see you tomorrow for day 2 of our 30-day read through of Thomas Brooks's Precious Remedies.